Rolling.
You need to leave.
Get out of here.
Chris, welcome to our first ever episode of On The Dotcast. Are you excited?
I'm thrilled, Jenna.
I can tell. So we've got 3 trends to talk through today. The first one is about alcohol or the lack of it. Brits are apparently sobering up. Then we're going to talk about Ozempic. And then we're going to talk about a mystery trend that I know nothing about, and I hope you'll reveal all in due time. So let's kick off with the alcohol trend. Talk us through it.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, Brits are sobering up. And this is really quite an interesting trend because we can compare globally. So Brits are traditionally one of the biggest boozers in the world. And again, that is founded on data. It's us, Australia, Japan, Bulgaria, the biggest markets for alcohol in the world. And we've been measuring alcohol consumption since around 2016. And what we see in the UK over that time is really interesting. So 2016, 2020, very flat line. It's about 1 in 4 Brits who drink alcohol regularly, which we define as more than once a week. And then we get to COVID, various lockdowns, and the data changes quite a lot. Big initial spike in the first lockdown, as you might imagine. People probably remember supermarkets, 3 things that were hard to get were toilet roll, pasta, and beer. Certainly in my experience. But what's happened after the pandemic has been really interesting, is that there's been quite a steady drop in the number of those regular alcohol drinkers. And in fact, in our most recent surveys, that number of regular alcohol drinkers in the UK was the lowest that we've seen yet.
That's really interesting. I've seen a ton of stuff on TikTok and all different types of generations. So like, I know Gen Z are historically the teetotal generation, but also like millennials, like recovering party girls. I see loads of TikToks about. So, I mean, who's driving it mostly? Is it Gen Z or is it actually all generations?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it touches a few different generations and audiences in different ways. So, I mean, we have a data set called GDY Alcohol where we can put this trend into the microscope, essentially, ask people who moderate alcohol why they do it. And there's quite an interesting age difference there. So under the age of about 34, if you're moderating alcohol, it'd be to avoid hangovers. You don't want to come into work the next day and feel like you're not at it.
Yeah, have the beer fit.
Well, exactly. And then over the age of 35, it seems to be more health reasons. You realize you're not immortal. And it's more a case of like, I need to, it's going to have an effect on my body. But within that, there are some interesting generational trends, like you mentioned. So one of the oldest questions we have in our research goes back to when GDY was founded in 2009, asking what topics people talk about online. If you look at the data for 2009 in the UK, audience of young people, 16, 24-year-olds, one of the things they're most likely to talk about online is alcoholic drinks. Do that again in 2024, same audience, 16, 24-year-olds in the UK, and that barely cracks the top 20. So over that time, there's been a huge change in, I think, the culture around alcohol, or, maybe not central for young people, and mirrors what we've seen in consumption, essentially. I think, there's a lot to do with that, possibly around social media, even the changing demographics in the UK. But also there's been growth among older consumers as well, who think, well, a bit more health conscious, don't really want to drink alcohol as much as they were doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess, what does it mean for brands? Like, are we going to see more low and no alcohol products come to market, or are we going to see more brands focus on like just doing one thing really well? So like Lucky Saint, for example, they just do one thing really well. They have one of the best non-alcoholic beers on the market.
So it's interesting you mentioned non-alcoholic beer, because there's just a really interesting parallel trend. So at the same time that we see alcohol consumption going down in the UK, we also see this big jump in the number of people who are drinking non-alcoholic beer. It's probably one of the biggest growth markets in the UK at the moment. And drilling into the audiences where their consumption of alcoholic beer is growing the most is really quite revealing. And it touches what you were saying before about generations, ages, different reasons. So if I was to do a pen portrait of the typical growth market consumer for non-alcoholic beer, it's going to be a woman over the age of 45, works in education.
That's not who I expected.
Yeah, no, me neither. Is interested in science, reads The Guardian. I mean, could be a science teacher for all the details that we've got. And I think it shows that there's some interesting target markets to tap into there. And again, like you say, it's probably not one you imagine as a typical beer drinking audience. So there's interesting new opportunities there.
Interesting. Okay, moving on to our next trend. I'm going to do that Reddit thing where I ask you to explain it to me like I'm 5. So let's talk about Ozempic.
Yes, I'll do my best with this. So Ozempic is an anti-obesity drug, and it's the brand name for a drug called semaglutide, I think it's pronounced. And it's a bit of a complicated one to explain. So there's Ozempic, which is the anti-diabetic medication that is sometimes taken for weight loss. There's also Wegovy, which is essentially semaglutide, and I think a different formulation, different concentration, that's sold for weight loss. So you have these different products, sometimes used for different reasons. We could just call them weight loss injections and just treat it as a general category. And what they do is they essentially mimic a hormone that typically tells the human brain, okay, you're full now and you need to stop eating. So Ozempic's really interesting because it was originally designed as an anti-diabetic medication, and now it's used for anti-obesity. So the kind of secondary effect is becoming the main selling point. And so if you're taking it and you feel full sooner and feel full for longer, then you go into calorie deficit, and that's what's allowed a lot of people to lose weight. And Ozempic weight loss injections are very interesting because, well, we know obesity is obviously a big health problem. It's been growing for a number of years. It's growing in a number of different countries around the world. And it's something that's really, really quite hard to work against. Most research shows that diets can work in the short term, but keeping the weight off long term is really, really difficult. So it could be incredibly potent for that use case alone. But then there's also really interesting second order effects to consider. So if you consider that means a whole group of people who might have been snacking a bit more suddenly aren't buying those products. If you're a big food, drink, nutrition multinational, you're going to be very interested in that. And there's side effects that we seem to be encountering a bit of anecdotal evidence for. So one is people who seem to lose weight on Ozempic, they experience something that's called Ozempic face. I'm not sure if you come across. Yeah, I think it's the idea that you might look a bit gaunt due to essentially how the weight loss works. So there could be a market of cosmetic treatments that come for that side effect. Similarly, some of the weight might actually come from your muscle mass, so that audience then becomes more interested in protein. So really interesting example of something that's designed for a specific case in medicine. This secondary effect has become more well-known, a bit like Botox or Viagra, both where the secondary effect became the main selling point after a while. And then all these second order effects that might come in as well.
Yeah. Do we actually have data on how many people are using it? Like, is it just this fad, like only an elite few, or is it actually more widely used than we think?
So we did a survey in February, I think it was, in the United States. And the measurement we got there was 5% of Americans had taken a weight loss injection of some kind. And for context, that's around the same number of Americans who own an electric car. So just to give you an idea of how many people that is. And I think it went up to 11% of diabetics. So of course the medicine is sort of officially marketed at. But it's interesting you mentioned, because I think the celebrity use case, something that comes across in culture quite a lot. I think Oprah Winfrey and Elon Musk have talked about their experiences on it. And it's probably how a lot of people have heard of it in the first place.
Well, I was going to say, because I feel like as far as I know, I feel like it's just celebrities that are using it. I don't know if our data says anything different, or if we know if, I don't know, the general public are using it. I don't even know how you would go about getting it. Like, is it legal in the UK?
So I'm not 100% sure. I think we can probably clarify in the description of this. I think in the UK, you can get it through the NHS for diabetes.
Fine.
And in the US, again, I think it's where it's sort of murky in terms of weight loss injections, because some people, using it not for the purposes it's been sold. But essentially, we can project forward a few years that this market will expand. There'll be other companies that come with their own products to the market. Patents will expire, and we can probably safely assume it'll become more commonplace. But to your original question about who's using it, it's quite interesting. I think that kind of elite class, if you like, that elite audience is there. But from what we see, the typical Ozempic consumer at the moment is, I'd put it this way, they might not be CEOs of their company, but kind of like VPs, department heads. So, upper middle class. And it also correlates with being early adopters, which makes sense. You've probably got to be comfortable with technology, this new kind of drug to be taking it in the first place. What's really interesting is the audience we capture when doing this survey of people who hadn't taken it, but would be interested in doing it in the future. And that was actually very different. So typically this is women aged 25 to 34. They might have children. They own brands like, Lululemon, active on social media, interested in things like beauty, which sort of suggests that kind of, I don't know if it's quite the right phrase, but more like lifestyle use of Ozempic
Yeah.
versus the strictly medical one. And obviously there's, all sorts of factors of why they may or may not adopt it in the future. But it's interesting to do that projection forward and think, how might that play a role in their lives?
Yeah, exactly. Very interesting. Okay, on to our next trend, which is a mystery trend, so I can't actually intro it.
Yes,
so you've got to take it away.
This is where I get certain questioner for once. So what do you think is the social platform that's increased its user base the most in the last 12 months in the UK?
12 months. I'm trying to think, when did Threads come out? Because everyone who has Instagram automatically got a Threads account, right? So probably Threads or TikTok, because it's just climbing.
So I suppose Threads, it might be technically correct, but let's say of social apps that were already around.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I'd say TikTok.
So it's actually Telegram. Have you heard of Telegram?
I have not heard of Telegram.
Yeah, Telegram Messenger, to give it its full name, is a messaging app. It's not too dissimilar from WhatsApp, but it's usually distinguished by feeling it's got an extra emphasis on security, end-to-end encryption, all those things. And it's got certain features that make it a bit more unique. So it has this thing called channels where, let's say if you imagine like you're opening a messaging app, you've got conversations with friends, but then you might have a message from a newspaper you follow being like, okay, like here's an article we published that we think you're going to be interested in. And it was founded, I think around 10 years ago in Russia by people who used to own VKontakte, which is like it's like their equivalent of Facebook essentially. And it's always been quite popular in the Russian speaking world. But we see in our data it's also become very popular in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, and is growing in places like the UK. So I was looking at this in our data the other day, and in Italy it's more popular than TikTok, LinkedIn, X, and Pinterest, which I really didn't know and I really didn't expect. So yeah, it's one that goes under the radar, I think, but it's been consistently growing the last few years.
That's interesting. When you say it's more popular in Italy, like what's the audience for this app? Like who is using it?
So I've only looked at the audience in the UK, to be fair, but I think we could probably generalize it'd be true of other places, that it's quite, again, not too dissimilar from Ozempic, techie people, early adopters, it's people who work in roles like software development, where I guess you're
techie guys.
Exactly. Like I suppose you're always thinking about, sort of new software and things that are very technically capable, and they're often people who tend to adopt a service before it becomes more used by the wider population. And, you can sort of see how these things spread. It's like, okay, friends of theirs, maybe family of theirs get involved too. And that's how you see this consistent growth over time.
Yeah. I guess zooming out then, like, is there any bigger implication of Telegram taking off? Like, what can we infer, like, bigger picture wise?
Honestly, I think even just being aware of it is important, because I think, there's so many social media apps that have come and gone essentially and received a lot of hype. And to be fair, different platforms, they have different levels of experience and comfort with approaching advertisers and marketers. It's not always a case of pure reach, but I just find it interesting to talk about and surface, because a lot of apps that we talked about as being like, oh, is this the next big thing? Is this the next challenger to X? But then there's this one that's sort of consistently been growing that doesn't really get that much attention. Like I had a look on the...
Well, I've just never heard of it before.
Yeah. And like you can sort of look on database of ad campaigns, and sometimes it'll be used in the context of like a wider palette of messaging apps. So, brands puts like sticker collections on WhatsApp and Viber and Telegram, but that's the only place you tend to hear about it. I mean, certain markets where it's popular, it's a bit different. But I think it's just interesting to see if there will be brands that decide to go and experiment with it. And that's probably the thing we want to look out for. Who does those initial experiments? What do we learn in addition to the data that we have? Yeah,
especially if they're trying to reach that kind of tech-focused audience too.
Exactly, yeah.
So now we're going to dive into a segment called Local Lowdown, where we look in depth at trends or characteristics of a specific market. So take it away. Where are we zooming into?
Today we are zooming into Hungary. Is that somewhere you've ever been to?
I did go to Budapest last November, and it was very, very cold. And I remember seeing no one on the streets, like it was a ghost town. And I said to my Uber driver, where is everyone? And he was like, they're all inside because it's too cold. So I think if I had been in the summer, it might have been a different experience, but it felt pretty ghost towny when I was there.
Yeah, I went to Budapest once a few years ago in September, where I probably caught the end of the tourist season. It felt a bit busier,
Yeah,
a bit more lively when I was there.
Better
But
experience.
there is a sense where your experience might have been more reflective of Hungary as a whole, because I'm going to say this, it sounds like a roast, but I need to emphasize this is empirically true. We've measured this with surveys. We can compare this to countries around the world, but Hungary is a uniquely pessimistic country.
Oh, we have data on that?
Yeah, so across all the markets in our data, 53 markets that we have, Hungarians are the most likely to think that their personal finances will get worse the next 6 months, that their country's economy will get worse the next 6 months.
Wow.
And that they will quit their current job. I mean, quit the current job, you could argue, goes both ways. But I think the fact that it's united by all three is quite telling.
Yeah.
And it's something that you can actually find precedent of, in Hungarian culture from years gone by. Like, it really seems to be something deep-seated in the culture. So there's this amazing 1991 New York Times article that you can find online. It's in their archives. And
Nice.
it's got this brilliant headline called "Hungarians are thriving gloomily."
Thriving gloomily.
Yeah.
I love that.
But the story behind this is really interesting. So 1991, this is just after the fall of communism in Europe. You get a lot of states that are newly independent, or they're all coping with this transition to market economies. And I didn't fully appreciate this because it's before I was born. But at the time, there's a lot of commentary analysis and think, well, which countries are doing the best, making the transition the best? Is there any kind of lessons we can take from this? It's almost like a natural experiment in a way. And as the article indicates, that Hungary is actually doing relatively well in a number of metrics. But when surveys were done among the population, they would consistently say that they felt the most negative or the most pessimistic about their future prospects.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like what we see now. There's this gap between what you might see in the headlines about GDP or unemployment rates, all these kind of macroeconomic stats versus how the people think and feel. And I think, not to sell it too hard, but it shows the importance of market research,
Yeah.
right? How human behavior is often unusual and irrational in light of these kind of hard statistics.
Yeah.
And it's something you can find traces of in Hungarian culture. So I've read, one of my favorite books is by a Hungarian writer, and the title of it speaks volumes. It's called The Melancholy of Resistance.
Nice.
And I feel that kind of gets to the quick of a lot of Hungarian culture. These books, these films, they're often quite bleak. They have kind of sad endings. And there's a quote, I think it's like it's like an idiom or phrase that you get in Hungarian culture, and it roughly translates to Hungarians console themselves through crying, or they cheer themselves up through crying. Yeah. It's something like that, but it just shows how embedded it is in the culture. And I'm just fascinated to think about this in a marketing context. If you're a brand that's looking at Hungary as the next market we're going to expand
Oh God,
in.
yeah, you need to know, yeah.
Yeah, maybe other markets that you've got that kind of perception of being quite perky, quite
happy-go-lucky.
Yeah, I don't know why, but orange juice always comes to mind.
Smiley faces.
Exactly. Maybe it's the sort of California connection or something. But in Hungary, it just wouldn't really resonate with the audience. Yeah. And there's actually quite interesting examples of ad campaigns that were done in 2020 by brands in Hungary, where there was this sense of like, well, now more than ever, we need to cheer each other up because we sort of know this exists in our culture. And there's a great one where I think it was the telecoms, like Hungary's equivalent of BT, essentially, like their main telecoms company. They reran one of Hungary's most famous moments in sport, which was when they beat England in the 1950s. Like, if you know football, that's like a big, big thing.
Yeah.
First time England were beaten at Wembley, I think. And there was a sense of like, well, this is something we can all get behind. This is all something that can cheer us up.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing to consider, these quirks of geography, history, culture shape consumer behavior even now.
Yeah, 100%. Thriving gloomily is a really nice phrase.
Yeah, that one's going to stick with me, I think.
It's quite a mood. Well, that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for joining us. If you like what you just saw, don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell to get notified for new episodes. If you do want to subscribe to The Real Deal, we run a newsletter called On The Dot, where every Wednesday you'll get trends delivered straight to your inbox, along with pop culture moments and things that we're reading. Check it out.